Hello, Letesia. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great
Yeah,
to be here.
thank you. I was already so curious and couldn't wait for this recording when we had our little exploration call. And you shared a bit about your story and the diversity, equity, inclusion space, how it changed, and how to have these difficult conversations about diversity, race, politics. So, yeah, very timely. And I always start at the beginning with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in my sort of early career, I probably would have described myself as a facilitator. I started as a qualitative researcher and then moved into brand strategy. So conducting focus groups and interviews and running workshops was very much kind of part of my everyday work. And I think the language I probably used then was more a facilitator. There's something about the work that I do now that feels more like being a navigator.
Mm,
I feel that's more the space, which feels maybe a little bit richer than facilitator. There's not, I don't want to kind of put any negativity around it, but I think the work of kind of navigating change, which really is about, for me, upgrading worldviews,
mm.
needs more than facilitating what's within somebody and helping them connect to a bigger narrative of them and their identity and how they kind of move forward with it. So for me, navigation feels more apt as a term.
Thank you. Um, like the term navigator. Haven't thought about it that way. And when I hear you describing your work helping people connecting to it, sense making also, it feels like a larger maybe coaching component. So to do the inner work and to look inwards.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, with my sort of career history, I've been a researcher, I'm also a coach, I've been a
Mm.
strategist, I've been an organizational consultant. So for me, there's something about bringing all of those skills together. But coaching for me is the kind of foundation that
Mm.
supports that and is what enables that navigation to be successful.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm very curious now how you merge these two, because if I'm not mistaken, in your work, you're helping organizations to discuss about the difficult conversations like diversity and inclusion, race, um, politics. I don't know to what extent maybe gender also comes into that space. How do you use both skills, the facilitation as a skill and the coaching as a skill, in your work and in organizations?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, let me see if I can do my best to try and answer that because in a way, I think the way that I bring them feels quite intuitive now, but it is helpful to think about unpacking them a little bit. For me, there's something about coaching which is always about considering the container in
Mhm.
which people are stepping in to do any kind of work. But even in the first conversations with an organization, thinking about that as being a container that already has the essence of a coaching dynamic to it. And then I guess the facilitation is when we really understand what some of the challenges might be, what some of the strengths might be also. We've got a real sense of the DNA of a person or a team or an organization. Then the facilitation then comes in to think about how do we design a journey or like what other things do we need with us
Mm.
to facilitate those steps forward.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work you do, just to have some context?
Yeah, for sure. It comes in all different shapes and sizes, really. I mean, we started, as I mentioned, I've been through a career of researching strategy, organizational development, coaching, and all of those kind of things come together. So we interact with organizations at different moments, right? Like some come to us when they have a problem. So I think that really was highlighted with George Floyd's murder back in 2020, when most of the world was on pause, and maybe in quite a reflective space as individuals. And it created a moment for people to look more reflectively at their own organization, and whether that was for a desire to be better or coming from a place of problems and issues now being very much in the spotlight. That tends to be quite a moment when we kind of hear from clients that they're really looking for some support. So problems that they're seeing or that are being highlighted to them. But it's also when there's just a recognition that there's a need for different leadership, or they are noticing challenges with belonging in their organization. That also is something that can come up. Or there are just maybe tensions within an organization where they might be noticing a little bit more us and them emerging, and they think there might be a racialized or identity component to that. So it can come in all different ways. And I think there's something about it often being quite hard for organizations to kind of pinpoint exactly what is the thing. Like maybe in other work, there's a confidence in thinking about how do we shape a brief, how do we engage somebody to work with us, because I have myself some good understanding of what's going on. Often we're in a conversation at a point where organizations don't really have the language or maybe the confidence to actually talk about what's going on. And so, yeah, that means we have to sort of work collaboratively to decide what is the work we're going to do together, maybe not with really understanding at the beginning what the real brief is actually.
Fascinating. It somehow the word shame came up for me, because I can only imagine that there is a component of shame around that if an organization realizes that they need help, something must have happened at a scale that they cannot ignore it any longer. But then how to deal with the fact that within an organization, they might have issues with discrimination, and how to approach that. So here I can again see the complementarity of the coaching, which is the very personal level. Who am I with my maybe unconscious biases? And who are we as an organization? And then the facilitation bits of how do we bring these people together to have a conversation, to change something, or to design a solution that may change something.
Yeah, it's a really interesting word to use, and we've talked about that a lot as a collective and with other practitioners. And I recently actually did a course run by the Gestalt Center on shame in organizations to really think about this through the lens of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think it is something that is almost always present. Because we kind of come from a sense. I mean, I work particularly with a lot of positive impact businesses that have socially oriented missions. And so you have within that an identity of we're good people doing good things. But in general, that is sort of how we tend to see ourselves as individuals. You know, if I ask people what their personal value system was, I can imagine fairness and equality live in there in some way. So the idea of having to acknowledge that there is a disconnect between you and maybe your behaviors or your organizational behaviors is a really difficult thing to reconcile. And I guess the way that we approach that is by, I guess, I had this phrase of called deshaming the field, by sort of bringing the shame in as a, observing it as a thing that's really there. And really, I always talk about racism, particularly racism. Obviously, there's other forms of discrimination, but I think racism is so endemic in our societies. But it's almost like it's the air that we breathe, right? Like, unless we've actually gone on an active journey of unlearning and thinking about what do anti-racist behaviors look like, then we're living in a system, we're perpetuating a system, we're contributing consciously or unconsciously to it. So I try and take it away from the individual who is sat there thinking, I don't want to be seen as a racist, to more of a narrative of we are probably all contributing to upholding a system of racism, unless we're thinking about how we can individually and collectively and systemically make some changes. And that can really help to look at that shame in a sort of reduce that shame and help people have a different relationship to it.
Yeah. It sounds like a cognitive dissonance. So I have this self-image and still I'm having these thoughts that don't stick with it. And what I hear is that you're basically normalizing the space. So yes, this is something that exists and that we all carry in one form or another, or support. How is that to hear for groups? Because I can imagine that there's also a different level of maturity or even knowledge around the topic. There might be those who are affected because they're in a racial minority, maybe. There are those who are totally blind. There are those who might then feel accused.
Yeah. And that is like the challenge of this work, is thinking about how you support different people of different identities, different levels of their journey, different levels of maturity around this to make a step forward. And I think that one of your questions was about, I don't want to jump to it, but one of your questions was about your number one facilitation challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it sits in this space for me about when is there support, when is there compassion, when is there challenge, and how do you meet all of the needs that might exist across all of those different spaces. And it really is quite something. Like, I feel now with more experience, there's a sort of inner diagnostics that I do when I'm working with a group or a client. Like, early on, I really want to get a sense of what is the picture of that. If I had to map all of this out, what would that look like? And what might that mean for the way that we design the work that we do together? Like, can we have white racialized and other racialized together in the same session? Is that going to be safe and supportive for our Black and brown colleagues? Where might the starting point be for a particular group based on where we can see where they're at on their journey? So yeah, there's quite a lot to think about, actually, just even in how we're going to bring a group of people together, and whether we do bring that group of people all together in a way to help them make a step forward.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So would that mean that so if there's a history of active racism or stories about racism in the company, you would first start with two separate groups, maybe?
Yeah, and if there was like a history of there being some like more overt racism, like if we had a sense of that, we might want to actually start with some investigation, like some one-on-one conversations to really understand the context in which that's being experienced within an organization. If the organization is asked to go on a learning journey, and it may be then that there's certain parts of the organization that need to start that learning journey first to be in a better position to guide the organization or hold the organization on a wider journey. So it feels really important to think about those things. But one of the things that I feel I've really thought a lot about is like, how do we role model? Like, how do we role model in any interaction in a way that sends a message to anyone in all of those groups that we can support them? So it's like you're kind of wearing so many different hats at the same time, thinking about all the different needs that they might have. But I think I've always found that trying to speak about racism, discrimination, any kind of systemic kind of issue in the way I would speak about any topic. Like, I really name when I feel like maybe you're feeling like this, or have we thought this might be a perspective of somebody's feelings? I kind of bring things in that allow us to not have them as taboos, but to have them in the room with us when we're kind of working. And I also think showing my own vulnerability, the things that I might find hard, moments that I might be triggered, I'm really kind of normalizing that those might be responses that we're all having. So yeah, so actually it requires quite a bit of energy, that is a different kind of energy. When I think back to when I ran workshops on different kinds of topics, even more sensitive topics like maybe team dynamics or friction within teams, it's like another additional kind of energy, which is needs a full presence.
Yeah, because it's so personal and intimate. And it is a big taboo very often, is something that nobody really wants to admit, that there might be unconscious biases. And it's I have the impression that, as you said, that, and I would include myself, lacking the vocabulary and maybe even lacking this, I wouldn't call it sensitivity, but the knowledge of what are the traps or the challenges? How can we, as facilitators, really create an anti-racist space? And what are maybe the blind spots?
Yeah, exactly. And I
The
think that's
unknowns. Yeah.
yeah, exactly that. And I think, it's so different when you are racialized by society, right? Where your skin color, your ethnicity, however you want to talk about that, is something that is always with you and always part of the narrative. So it's part of the experience. Whereas I think what we're trying to do here is take groups of people who maybe haven't really ever thought about the impact of their race, maybe not even see themselves as a race, to acknowledge that they are also racialized and that within the system that we live in, there's different experiences depending on what race you are. And that that is something, because it isn't always true if you are from the global majority, but I think you're more likely to have a bit more vocabulary, and definitely will have your own lived experience. Whereas, within the white community, we're often having to provide those frameworks and concepts so that they can start to understand their own experience.
What would be, from your experience, be like little almost tripwires where unconsciously we don't think that, or we are making it difficult to be fully inclusive or to acknowledge the diversity in the group and to make it anti-racist?
Yeah, what are the tripwires? I mean, I think the kind of the solution lies in recognizing that as a standard and as a norm, pretty much everything in society is designed with white people in mind. Usually white people native to that country, right?
Mm.
Often men. It's often also designed for white men. And so it's an awakening and a kind of activating a curiosity to pay attention to those spaces. If you think about anything like going and taking a bank loan, going for a promotion, going into a healthcare system in need of support, like in all of those instances, there's going to be moments where there's a different experience, a different service, a different interaction based on race. And so the tripwires are kind of everywhere, really. But the antidote is within us to start to notice and pay attention to those and think about, within my sphere of influence and power, what is it that I can start to change, observe, like make others aware of, and what part can I play in that transition from something that seems just standard and normal, but actually is quite inequitable to be something equitable. So I think the biggest tripwire is sort of the denial and ignorance, really, to that, which may or may not be an aware thing. So there's some sort of no judgment about that. But I think that is that sort of journey from shame to accountability that, once we're in the accountability space and we have some awareness of actually, this is how the world works for everybody, not just for me or people like me, that more things are possible.
Yeah. And I wonder whether it's different for then in an organizational context where you have colleagues and you're building this culture and this awareness and acknowledge that the experience of going to work is different for everyone. And then you have those experiences where maybe someone from outside comes in and doesn't know about the wounds or the trauma or the of the organization, and their approach to diversity and inclusion. How do you think can a facilitator working with organizations that show diversity, but we don't know what their story is, what's the best way to approach it?
Yeah, from a facilitator perspective, as opposed to thinking about like research or understanding of people's experiences, you mean? So focusing specifically on a facilitator's role. So I think there's something about having to not put the emphasis on only hearing about those stories, right? Because actually the challenge is the dominant culture that's coming, that's creating moments of friction and challenge and discrimination and racism for people of a marginalized background. So in a way, the kind of the space to really put your attention to is thinking about how is the dominant culture not serving everybody. Because it's important to understand if people are having negative experiences in the work, however small and slight they might be, or how significant they might be. And there can be all kinds of mechanisms you can have in place for measuring that. There's all kinds of surveys, there's the reporting systems. But ultimately, if that group does not trust in that organization to make any change, to listen, if they don't want to have to educate them as part of sharing their experience in order to get some action as a result, then that's quite there's not really, of course there's a value in understanding and people being heard, but in terms of creating change, neither group is really in the best place to make that change happen. Whereas if we can raise the awareness of the ways in which dominant culture is exclusive, I mean, I look a lot through the lens of anti-racism, but actually what I see is the benefits of doing this kind of work are realized by all kinds of identities, because once we start to think about equity and belonging in a deeper way, then we start to rebuild an organization that genuinely can work for everybody.
And I was just thinking of neurodiversity, for instance, or even different preferences depending on whether we're an introvert or an extrovert. So when we are designing group experiences, we have to think of different preferences, different personalities, different ways how our brains work. And then I think I wonder to what extent then the DEI lens would be a different a really different lens, or just supported by this general approach that we hopefully do in our work as facilitators anyway?
Yeah, can you say the question again for me?
I'm not sure whether it was really a question or pondering, where when we think of all the diversity in groups, neurodiversity, personalities, how outspoken someone is, and we design for that, to what extent the lens of cultural diversity, diversity in race, needs a total new layer or different layer, or whether it would fit into these general layers already.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what the topic is, right? Like if the topic is, if it is more focused on racism and becoming anti-racist, then obviously there's going to be a really kind of specific way that you're going to need to think about designing that. But obviously we're made up of many different aspects of our identity. So, you know, you can be Black and have ADHD and be introverted and come from a working class family, or you know, there can be so many things that might affect your uh, ways of processing, your abilities to speak up and brainstorm, or being creative exercises with different people. So yeah, for me, I think it depends a little bit on the topic, but I do think the journey that we're on now, to be considering all of these different ways in which people come into a space and can engage with the topic and what the needs might be, feels really healthy. But it's challenging, right? It's challenging as a facilitator, because I don't know about you, but I feel that much of my journey with facilitation has been really built on a model of extroversion, really. Um, yeah, it's about people speaking up and sharing ideas and participating in, and maybe not so much about thinking about the ways in which we can really get the best from people and the individual needs that they might have, because maybe we have an idea of what a good facilitated session looks and feels like.
Mm.
I don't know if that's something that you also find in your work, but I found I've had to adjust my ideas of what good, I put it in the quote marks,
Yeah.
good looks like,
Yeah.
because I can have a really tricky session with lots of silence and not a great deal of interaction, but actually the group has made some really important steps forward, either together or as individuals, in ways that I can't see on the surface.
Yeah, 100%. I do recall these sessions where I was like at the end, did they actually enjoy it? Did they get something out of it? Because whenever we're in the plenary, it was silent. Nobody answered any of my questions. But then when they went into the breakout groups, I could see that everyone was talking and they came back with a smile. And then the question then is also, okay, what is the overall dynamic or the level of psychological safety within the organization that makes that? Or is it really the comfort of speaking in front of the large group? And I think it's, yeah, it's so complex. I learned early on that, okay, we start small before inviting someone to speak in front of everyone. We break them up and we have small groups. I always start with a turn to your neighbor moment. So to have pairs. And it was quite late on that I then received the feedback that for some, being in a one-on-one space with someone early on is quite intimidating, and can be triggering because they're confronted with this one person and cannot run away. I was like, I haven't thought of that. So is then the trio better, but then you don't get as deep in the conversation potentially, because three has a very different dynamic. So yeah.
Yeah, it's really tricky to navigate that. And I think that's something that I do sit with quite a bit, because we get a lot of feedback from our programs. And one of the things that I feel I've been navigating is like, what does it mean to be in a space of discomfort because of the topics that we're discussing? And also maybe have discomfort that comes from other sets of needs, like I'm an introvert, or other aspects of your identity that might mean that maybe you have some mental health challenges that are particularly at the fore here. And it can be really difficult to navigate, like, when is this a response to being in a space of discomfort and not wanting to be there because of the topic, and when is it a challenge because of other aspects of their identity. And I had a recent invitation to like reconnect with my own idea of what it means, what engagement looks like. And it's something I don't have the answer yet. I feel like every client that I go into, and I feel I learn something new about this, because also our understanding about other aspects of identity is also evolving, I think, particularly around neurodivergence and mental health in the workplace. So that can be a challenge when you're thinking about how to design something that actually helps everybody move forward. But also when your model, and my model very much is, I'm trying to normalize conversations about this. So sometimes it means being in the discomfort, sometimes it means being triggered, because that is what happens in the real world. And here we can have that experience in a supported environment and figure out, how do we move forward with this, as opposed to kind of treating everything with, like, when we see that word trigger, it can feel like a scary word and something to be avoided. But in a way, I think there's an inevitability of it in the work that I do. And I think it's about helping people see that they can form different relationships with their triggers, and that it maybe provides some learnings for them about the spaces that there's work to do on this journey of unlearning.
Yeah. I love that, changing the relationship with our triggers. Yeah, because well, it's a long way to get rid of our triggers, and it won't happen in a workshop.
Exactly. Yeah.
And still, yeah, it's a beautiful environment to just become a little bit more aware of them. Yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, changing the ownership. So, because I think the contribution as facilitators we can make in this space is to change, and maybe that's what you meant with changing the relationship to the triggers, that initially we think it's the other person. You are doing this to me because you talk too much, for instance. But then to have the awareness that, oh, it's me responding to this person speaking in a different way or in a specific way that actually makes me
Exactly
feel
that.
uncomfortable.
Exactly that. And that feels really important. And I think when I first started doing this work, if I'm completely honest, I think I felt some kind of accountability to making a space where that triggers were not triggered. And then I think even just a few months in of like running regular sessions, I started to really understand that my role was not to be accountable to that. It was to help other people be accountable to their own triggers, to recognize that they are telling them something about their own experience. And obviously that's going to be really different for different ethnicities, but it's part of their own learning journey. And I mean, I think it's more of an unlearning journey. And I think that unlearning journey is for every ethnicity, right? We all are going on a journey to figure out, how do I be and exist in a system that's like this? So I think really understanding your triggers for me is a big part of that journey from shame to accountability, or from shame to acceptance, whatever the kind of axis needs to look like for you.
Yeah. And what an interesting growth journey for you to realize that it's not on you, and actually protecting the space from all these triggers is actually doing more harm than good, because then you cannot have these conversations that you actually need to have, right?
Yeah, and I think some of that came from me being triggered myself in sessions. Like, what does that happen when you're the facilitator or you're the, the holder of the space, and you yourself of, you can feel something very physical happening in your body. I mean, I before I started this work, actually, I did some work developing my skills in somatic coaching, because I was really, I don't know, just instinctively, I really felt like I wanted to bring more of our body and our kind of body intelligence into the work. I was particularly interested in burnout when I started that.
Mhm.
And it was obviously, it's a very kind of physical experience, but that is very cognitively managed and processed, right? And it feels like the work that I did there has laid a great foundation for the work that I do here, because I really do think about body and mind together
Mhm.
in the experience. And triggers are you feel them in your body. That is where they first show up, right? Whether it's like a hot flush or an anger or a shutting down or whatever that. Yeah, exactly. And I'm trying to help clients like start to notice things more about their body and their like physical behaviors,
Mm.
as a giving them some different tools to actually notice these moments. And rather than it be a reaction, we start to kind of create that space and start to think about how that could be responded to differently.
Yeah, because very often in organizations or it's ignored that we do have a body and not just a brain. And you just said something talking about burnout, and caught my curiosity and would love to understand better what you meant. That it's a physical experience, but very cognitively processed. Is this what you said?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I had a burnout, so I can speak very much from personal experience. The experience for me was very much like your head was kind of being, it's like your head was sort of carrying around your body in a way, making all the decisions, like about how much you could take on, how much you could do, rationalizing, telling you a different story, pulling the wool over your eyes. I don't know if you know that kind of phrase of, yeah, like trying to hoodwink you into thinking that everything is okay. Whereas your body actually had all of the intelligence, the things that were happening in your body, the tiredness, the need to shut down, the heart rate, the lot of physical things happen to you during a burnout that just get ignored. And it's like the head has become the boss and has turned off the information that's
Mm.
coming from the body. And so this sort of disconnection is the thing that's stopping you from making any changes to your life, because you care about how you're seen. It depends what your burnout is about. Mine was about a misalignment with values with an organization I was in. So I was trying so hard to live in a values aligned way, and that needed me to not listen to my body to help me to achieve that.
Thank you for sharing that. Makes a lot of sense. And I now also see how you can bring this experience to organizations because, as you said, if it's a trigger, if it's a discomfort, if it's a any challenge or topic that is taboo, we sense in our bodies it's not safe to go there.
Mm.
And then it does something to the dynamics.
Exactly that. And I think there's a really interesting relationship between, not relationship, more confusion that we can have between not feeling safe and feeling uncomfortable.
Mm.
And often we feel being in some discomfort as not being safe. And
Or
that can often come up, especially if, and I think there is I mean, not to stray too far, but if maybe you come across the white supremacy cultural traits, which talk about this kind of wider conditioning that we're all affected by, irrespective of who we are and what our ethnicity is, which have become really synonymous with how businesses operate. There's really I've lost my trail of thought there actually. What was I saying? Oh, I was talking about discomfort, and yeah, okay, let me come back to that. Yeah, so there's really something about the white supremacy cultural traits, which are a set of 12 traits that have been developed by practitioners over 20 years, just observing, going into organizations and observing practices and sharing in an open source way. And they've developed these 12 traits. And when we look at them, if you didn't know what they were, you would say, okay, in my organization, I could tick 8 of those. And they're just part of organizational life. But one of them is the right to comfort. And I do think that is a really interesting one when we start to think about what preserves the status quo. And it is this feeling that I have a right to comfort. I can expect to have this experience, not be challenged, not be faced with conflict, not have to deal with a lot of emotions. And that creates a bit of a challenge for us when we're trying to step into the discomfort in order that we can break through it to get to acceptance and accountability.
This is very interesting. And I haven't heard of the 12 traits of white supremacy. And the right of comfort explains a lot.
Yeah, it really does.
And I was,
Defensiveness and denial is another one. So you start to then see actually there's quite a bit within here that is protecting us, some of us. I think it's protecting some of us from being in a space where more meaningful change is possible.
interesting. I was discussing with a friend of mine who is a man of color, highly educated, married to a white woman, and just experiencing racism in the organization, working for a big multinational. And so we talked about the middle-aged white manager who made a career. And it was interesting what he mentioned was that what white middle-aged men in Europe and maybe also the US don't realize is that they never had to please anyone in order to advance. And it was never so obvious for me. I was like, oh yeah, even as a woman, we are brought up that we have to please others. We have to be nice. And then and he's a big man, very kind, but very big and a martial artist. He said he doesn't jaywalk. That's what he learned, because if he breaks the rules, crossing a street where the traffic light is on red, he's the bad guy. A white middle-aged dude doesn't care.
Yeah. Or there would be high levels of trust that, oh, they didn't mean to do it. Oh, they made a mistake. You know, there's more forgiveness that would be when mistakes were happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is what I mean about growing the awareness of the dominant culture and just the practices that happen and are kind of often benefiting others in the dominant culture.
Yeah.
With an assumption that it's the same experience for everybody when it really clearly isn't.
Yeah. And when we talk about race, or there are also other components to cultural diversity, to religion. And then so some diversity we can see, others we cannot see. And I'm thinking of I was in an improv theater class, and then suddenly we had an introduction. One introduced themselves as Ukrainian, the other one as Russian. And we could feel the tension in the room. And when the two of them were on stage to play with each other, there was something that everyone could notice. We didn't talk about it. But over the weeks, it went away, which was also beautiful to see that art and culture can actually overcome this. But then when I think of an organizational context where we might have Muslims and Jewish people, especially now at the moment with the Gaza conflict, we might have Russians and Ukrainians. how do you, is this a different topic or an additional layer? How do organizations actually approach that? Because while, and maybe this is me being naive, I'm looking forward to you just showing me the way, but I would think that there's some levels of diversity that directly impact the everyday working together, and others that are so subtle that they almost go unnoticed because they've always been there.
Yeah, it's a complex space, I think, and I think it's a really important one that we start to grapple with. That how do I want to start with this? Because there's so many threads in here that feel like important to speak to. So I feel like there is really something in here about like, what is the journey of equity, diversity, and inclusion in service of? Like, if we are genuinely wanting to create an organization that puts belonging at the center of the experience and, you know, promises an equitable experience for everybody, then all of these other aspects of identity need to be considered as part of that, because we're whole people, right? And these are all parts of us. But I feel like there are some aspects that feel even more taboo than racism. Religion, for one, I think creates a lot of nervousness in organizations. So perhaps beyond supplying spaces for prayer, recognizing, you know, religious moments or practices or holidays, I don't think organizations yet have the skills to navigate some of the things that are happening in the world. And I feel that there is this kind of comes back to the white supremacy cultural traits, actually. It's like organizations are not political. We don't deal with anything that's not, you know, it's not in our space, it's not within our remit to navigate that. And so I mean, it's what we're seeing now, right? There's a sort of a silencing and a censoring and a avoidance of raising certain topics and issues, which from an EDI perspective isn't great for people who are feeling aligned, connected, affected by those because of their identity or their background. So in a way, you know, organizations are failing some of those people because they've made commitments to be, and that's something that they're not able to do in these moments. And then for me, there's another layer on this, which is I've heard of some organizations sharing challenges of what does it mean when somebody's religion actually maybe has a particular perspective on the queer community. What does it mean when someone's cultural background maybe has a certain outlook on disability? And these are now different, more nuanced challenges to be thinking about. Actually, how do we stay to our commitment of creating a culture that and an organization that really can hold equality and our sort of ideals up for that in a way that also supports those individuals? So yeah, we're moving into some more complex spaces, I think.
And what would be your advice to an organization or maybe a manager to approach, so not to silence this, but first of all to acknowledge, but then maybe even to play a more active role?
I feel there really is some, I mean, I don't even know if I think like a manager would really be only the right space to be having that conversation. It feels like that would be more of a organizational effort, to be honest. But I think if I think firstly to the manager level, I would think human first. Like, we can acknowledge that there's things happening in the world that might be affecting our Muslim colleagues, our Jewish colleagues more than others, or, you know, in a more direct way. And just acknowledging that really is an act of demonstrating, I'm seeing you, I'm seeing your experience. And just even that as an act, I think, can hold a lot of power. But in terms of like defining a way that this feels sort of integrated into their work on EDI, which actually so few, I have to say, I think so few people are thinking about it through this lens. We're seeing things happening in the world that to me feel very much connected to anti-racism. I'm seeing so many anti-racist organizations not being able to find a way through. So I think from a facilitator perspective, there's a role to play in how do we help organizations work out what their kind of support, voice, action might be on this. And that might look really different depending on the organization, the sector they're in, the makeup of the workforce, where they're based. But it does feel like a journey that feels important, not for just what's happening in the world right now, but if we imagine that the world is going to continue to become complex and increasingly globalized, connected issues that do affect this work of EDI.
In our exploration call, you shared about a project you're doing with or facilitating conversations about the current conflict in Gaza. And you mentioned that these political conflicts can work as a magnifying glass. And thinking back of that, I have my own interpretation of what you could have meant by that. I thought maybe I'll ask you.
Yeah, and I think that magnifying glass piece is true actually for any challenging issue that you might be working with an organization on, because I see it also in the work on anti-racism, and have had to pause a number of projects actually, because we've noticed there's some different dynamics going on here, or the fact that we're doing this deeper work or having these deeper conversations has highlighted that maybe there's an us and them culture, maybe organization we've really got a challenge with being able to be in conflict. Maybe we have a hierarchy that is really playing out here and really making it difficult to make progress in this way. So I think that is true also for the conversations that I've had with leaders around Israel and Gaza, is that it starts to shine a light on other dissatisfaction, or if there was a crack, it makes that crack bigger and more obvious. Like maybe that's the way of thinking about it.
Thank you. So it's basically the salt in the wound that, or the extra drop that brings us to explosion. And then when you say that you pause projects, is because you realize that on the organizational level, upper management, they were actually not really interested in going there, or they haven't sorted out things and maybe just wanted the label of, oh, we invest in DEI.
Yeah. Well, luckily, one of my early learnings, I talked about this growth journey that I've gone on in my organization, has been to really try and think about what are some of the criteria that give me a sense that I've got leadership support on this journey, because it's so important. So it's not usually that, but it usually is something that we've observed that is going to affect the ability of that organization to really go on its journey after we leave. Can we trust we've left and there's enough momentum for you now to really start to make some action happen? And that feels really important to us, because it is one of my personal rules. Like, I'm here to make an impact. And so that's why we don't do one-off workshops, or we work on a long-term journey with people who are interested in real transformation. So because they've kind of bought into that, then the pause moments are recognized something we want to do together, and that there's a kind of a real value to them as a leadership team in leading this organization in any context, apart from anti-racism or whatever the issue is we're going in. And so often what we find through our work is that the benefits that they get through the relationship are more than becoming anti-racist or more than finding a way through on a tricky issue, but actually help them function better as a team, or navigate. They have different skills that help them run their organization and come together as a group.
Yes, I 100% see that, because if you can talk about these topics, if you can sit in this discomfort together, it means that you have achieved a level of psychological safety that you can then talk about any difficult thing. And the annoying colleague, because they're leaving the window open while you're cold, suddenly is not the opportunity for a big conflict, but just for a conversation.
Exactly that. And I think one of the things that really helps with that is like skillful framing of issues or challenges, and giving the people involved shared language and shared tools that really help them step outside of whatever might be going on individually or in those relationships and come together around something new. So I think like the role of like creativity and also the role of inspiration. Like I think that you would think that it might feel like quite depressing things that we're speaking of, but and it's not that we're trying to like move away from the challenging things, but we can be inspired to think about how we could be different, how we could be better. There's an aspirational aspect to what we're trying to do here, and I think by bringing the framing, the toolkit, actually then organizations have a different way of coming to the conversation or coming to topics that doesn't necessarily bring everything that they used to bring. So they're able then to get somewhere new.
So what I'm hearing is the shared vocabulary, maybe also to make sure that when we speak about the difficult topics, we're not accidentally triggering someone just because we don't know how to speak about it.
Exactly.
And then not only because, I can see that how you can get sucked into the drain of everything is so bad.
Exactly.
What is the better future that we can shape, at least here for our small context, even if we cannot change the world immediately.
Exactly. And that last point is so vital, because we can all look at the world and feel overwhelmed by what we're seeing. But I actually feel very excited about the power of an organization, because they have almost like a walled garden, right? Of in this space, you step into this organization and we can create a different experience to what the rest of the world or society is. And that's our choice. And we have customers or communities or citizens, depending on what space you work in, that can also have an impact on and make some change. So I really try and get organizations to tune into their sphere of influence and just to focus on that only. And of course, there's benefits. People share benefits of relationships and family dynamics and friendship circles that have also seen some of the benefits of what they've been doing. But actually, what it does is it helps that organization understand what can I do, and in a way that makes sense to what they do. So it isn't like I mean, there is a morality piece to this, but that usually isn't why people are doing it. But I think having the sense making of, we're a charity that's focused on cohesion in communities. Okay, now we're thinking about all of the community, and we have a much more expansive way of understanding that. So it's about, really connecting it to their space of influence and the work that they do. That's also part of what makes it feel more energizing, because the journey that we've gone on is
I don't feel I can do anything. I feel like I'm the problem. Society is looking at me like I'm the problem. I don't want to engage with this.
Mm.
To, oh, actually, there's a lot we can do, and I feel supported, empowered. I've got the tools. I'm with my colleagues, and here's what we can do.
Yeah. And I can see it as a important or vital part of reconnecting to the company values, organizational values, just beyond the buzzwords, and to have the real conversations.
Yeah, exactly. And I think values, they're such a great thing when they are lived, which maybe has been a little bit your experience, but it's so great when they are lived really intentionally and a culture is built on that because it means they've addressed all the hidden values and, you know, the values that are just there by the nature of the people that are in the room as opposed to being the culture we want. So when that exists, it's embedding this in those
Mm.
values is super helpful. But when they don't exist or when they're there just on paper and there's actually quite a lot of other things going on, then yeah, we sometimes do work with organizations to think about how do we look at our values and think about the behaviors we want to see through a lens of belonging and equity.
And humanizing the workforce. Yeah. Because, and I wonder whether the avoidance of bringing the company values as a shared experience or something that everyone can live by, because this also requires a conversation, open conversation. What do these values that maybe the leadership team at one point decided to set, what does it mean to every individual? Um, can also be an uncomfortable and vulnerable conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that I mean, that probably could be a whole separate podcast on values because right now values are really important, right? These are some of the things that are creating these tensions. Do I really believe these leaders, this organization is who I thought they were? Like, do we value the same things? Are we, are we living by a similar or complementary value system? Because I mean, obviously our personal values don't need to be exactly the same as our organizational values, but we want to have some connection between them that we can see. And yeah, I feel like very often values are not very well embedded. I mean, we can probably name a handful of organizations between us where we see the values and then we see that in everything that they do, which
Yeah.
is they're the real standout organizations whose cultures we look to as very aspirational. But actually that journey to living values is quite it's a journey. And so in this, I always think about habits, like what are the habits that we can be putting into place that kind of habits and rituals, I think are a really big part of cultural life.
Mm.
And so that's also a space to think about equity and belonging. Like, where are the habits and rituals that are facilitating that and blocking that? And how does that look different in different parts of the organization? It can be quite a kind of practical way to start to notice,
Yeah.
like even little moments, like when it's the start of a team call, like, and people are sharing about their weekend. I mean, I've seen this one come up quite a bit, right? People are sharing about their weekend, and let's say there's 12 people on the call, and like 11 of them seem to have some shared experience about the way they do their weekend. They all watch the bakery TV competition that might be on. I'm sure most countries have something like that. They all go to the pub, they all do similar very things. And there's one person whose experience of weekends is really different for all different kinds of reasons. And they can't find a way into that conversation. And so there's always this disconnect. And
Mm.
unless we're sort of noticing some of those moments and thinking about how could we design this differently, then we've missed an opportunity to really kind of embed a habit of belonging.
Yeah. What would be a small ritual that could foster a sense of belonging then? Do you have one?
Yeah, I guess there's so many, and I guess it sort of really depends on like the organization and their context. But one of the things that I've seen work really well, I learned this from another leader that I interviewed, and we've now put it into our own organization, is we just start every Monday with an intentional Monday session.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, we bring something that really is connected to us in the world, and it might be a bit of news that feels like it's really had an impact on us. It might be a bit of art or kind of theatre that we've seen, and in those moments, it's just like a half an hour sharing. We connect to each other in a really different way, and it sort of sets the tone for our week. So we've broken the habit of starting on a Monday with, what's our to-do list? What's everyone doing? Right, off we go. And we've chosen to replace that with a habit of connecting to each other and to the world and seeing what feels live for us. And it really has changed the energy of how we connect together, actually, just that one small half an hour ritual. So I think it's thinking about, and obviously in a hybrid world now, or even a remote world, like we're having to think a lot more intentionally about how we build culture generally, but also how we build culture equitably. And, you know, what does it mean to belong when we are not physically together?
Yeah. And I love this little ritual on a Monday morning. And I think it's a good reminder, even on an individual level. It's so easy to rush into the to-do instead of set intentions or think a gratitude journal or something. Because yeah, where did I read that recently? That the first hour of our day really determines how stressed or non-stressed we are for the remainder. And I think to model that with a team, to say, okay, it's worth our investment, our while to invest in sense of belonging, getting to know each other, appreciating what we have, the slowing down to then speed up.
Exactly that. And I think there really is something for me about trust and relationship investment that's kind of fundamental to creating cultures of belonging. I think trust, relationship, and power. Like if I had to triangle, those probably would be the three things that feel really important to be aware of. And I think there's so little space now to really do those things like the trust and relationship well. And there's not enough focus on thinking about power dynamics. And so that makes it a little bit challenging if we're not making space for that. I mean, I saw one of my clients recently. We did a workshop on belonging with their whole team, and then their team day, their next team day they actually took the day to go out for a walk, and they just had 3 questions on the agenda for the whole day, and they were focused around like cultivating a culture of belonging. And they just shared the sort of the impact of that experience and actually how much richer it was than being in a meeting room with a packed agenda, that sense you've got to be really productive because you're using the time. They actually did more for the sense of belonging and actually also benefiting the organization at the same time. So I think it's sometimes being creative about the ways in which we can inject these moments. Because I think the other thing to say is like there will always be moments of discrimination, racism, disconnection, not belonging. Like they're going to be with us. But if we can foster environments where it feels that people can be aware when those are happening, we can learn from them, people have the trust to share that they've taken place, that we can grow as a result. Like those are some of the ingredients that are going to be most important. Because I think the idea of a destination being we've eradicated everything is a little idealistic. I think it's more healthy to think, well, what do we need as kind of foundations to help us navigate when there are bumps in the road, which there inevitably will be. And we can be in a place of things not being as we want them, but still foster a culture of belonging that allows us to make progress.
Yeah. Also in the goals we set, because as you said, if if the goal would be to eradicate all these problems, then we're coming back to the shame we talked about at the beginning. Oh, we haven't achieved that, so we are not good enough, we're not trying hard enough. And then it's more difficult to talk about it.
Exactly that.
And then instead, if we create this spaciousness, as in your example with a walk, I think it's a beautiful example because it shows courage to say, okay, instead of having a packed agenda, we have 3 questions and we're going on a walk. And it creates a sense of agency because you trust that they will get whatever they need in this walk and with the 3 questions.
Exactly.
And yeah, I can see how this could create more sense of belonging and a culture of mutual exchange and not talking about these difficult topics even.
Yeah, exactly. But we need as a foundation with that is psychological safety, right? I mean, I listened to one of your other podcasts on play, and I was just really like hearing that the need to kind of balance psychological safety when you're asking people to step into something new or something different. And it's the same thing here. And I think in this instance, it really comes from visible leadership. You know, seeing leaders role model, appreciating, valuing, understanding, sharing their learning journey, being vulnerable, indicating why this is important to us in small ways. Actually, it doesn't necessarily need to be a big, you know, statement out. It's more about how it's evidenced in behaviors as much as what is said. And when that's there, a lot is possible, because I think there needs to be in an organization somebody or some people who are able to hold, like create the container without the consultants and the facilitators and the people helping them. The end result is that they can hold this for themselves. And yeah, that isn't to say it's only the responsibility of the most senior people. It probably needs to start there in order that it can be a kind of a shared responsibility. So I think that framing feels important, because when people dive into, oh, we're just going to do a meeting that's all about sharing, you know, as you can imagine, all kinds of other things come up. So there's a learning of how to be in that kind of organization. Like there's a growth journey that we need to take people on, but it will strengthen us as an organization in so many ways to navigate lots of things that we're faced with as modern organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, also to onboard those who have benefited from the white supremacy and might not see the need to have any of the conversations that we talked about. That's also a kind of a change process and needs a slow onboarding.
Yeah, a slow onboarding or an offboarding, right? Because again, it may be that there's a misalignment with like where people are at, with where the organization is going.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a kind of a hard truth, I think, of like if we're digging deeply into this work, that it may mean that that some people no longer fit. But it may mean that we become a kind of a shining light to the people who do see this as an important part of how they're moving forward. And that's true of people who might be showing resistance. You know, there's that line between support and, you know, compassion, support and challenge. Like there's only so far, you know, there's a time limit to that. Like, no, I haven't really articulated that in the right way. Yeah, what do I want to say here? Yeah, you can only really bring people that are wanting to step into the journey, right? They might be dipping their tiny little toe in just to see how it is. And that's enough. You know, if you've stepped forward that little bit, then we can support you. But if there's active resistance,
Yeah.
that's a really different picture. And I think that needs a different kind of conversation in that organization at the right point. And the reverse is true of marginalized people, you know, like going on a journey to be in an organization. We're seeing this aspirational future of who we want to be, but your everyday experience is this. Like, that's going to take some time for that organization to be in a place where consistently they're showing up in a better way. And maybe there's some questions for you to ask yourself about, are you in for the journey, or is this time for you to realize that you need to be in an environment that's more on a par with where you are at?
I haven't even thought of that challenge, that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But then you see everything that's going wrong, and it's easy to get impatient. Yeah.
And I think sometimes that is why, you know, and why it's really important to respect when our brown and black global majority colleagues don't want to engage in a process like this. You know, that also happens. I've been here before. I've said this so many times before. Like, I don't want to have to relive this, or I know that it's there. I have my way of surviving. My system works very well. I don't want to open the bonnet to mess it all up, even with the promise of it being put back together in a better way. So I think that feels really important to hear those voices. And, you know, when those things come up, we often adapt what we do with people. We find different ways of keeping them connected to the journey in ways that sort of really respect where they're at. I mean, that isn't to say that there isn't learning for everybody to do. You know, I have had many global majority colleagues share how much they've learned about themselves, understanding their own experience, having new language and ways of understanding what was maybe more of a visceral experience before. And now I can actually speak about it and be articulate about it. And actually, that's really empowering. But whether they are ready to do that is a kind of a personal question, right?
Yeah, I can see that, because also if you're in the minority and then you sit in these workshops where basically the entire group talks about you and how you're different, this can be quite, demanding.
Yeah, exactly. So we would always, this is part of our initial mapping of an organization. Where are people at? Who do we need to have one-to-one conversations with? How would they feel being in that context? Do they want to be in it? Are there certain people that would be good to be in it with? Is there a value to them being in it? Is it something we come back to later with that group? Do we run something separate with certain groups? Like, that feels really important, that is kind of like designed together. We don't come in with a view on that. And I think creating a bespoke way of thinking about how we do that. Are there some support sessions along the way for those people in particular? Do we need to help advocate their voice? I always make it really clear that nobody needs to, you know, we're not, what is the phrase now? Maybe it escapes me, but the idea of, yeah, is it called trauma voyeurism? I think maybe might be the word. Like, yeah, like people's stories are their stories, and they're not there to be stimulus for the group to learn from. And so we really create an environment where people are not required in any shape or form to share their stories, and ensure that they're having a learning experience that's supportive to them. But also the reality is, if we've got a diverse team in terms of different ethnicities, like, we need to build a muscle for how we work better together, right? And these are some of the dynamics that are happening all the time, but we're just not talking about it in a way that is allowing us to move forward. So I don't think there's a one size fits all, but as you can hear, like, there's a number of different lines of inquiry of how you might navigate that and support that in the best way.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. One question that I always ask, what makes a workshop fail?
Yeah, I was really pondering this question, actually, thinking, what do I think it is? And I feel like there's probably one thing, which is a lack of presence.
Mm.
Like, I think if you have designed a workshop that allows people to be present, presence, I kind of mean not necessarily like being super engaged or like, you know, offering lots of perspectives, but also being present for themselves. Like for me, maybe that's the most important thing, noticing what's happening for them, processing, reflecting. I think presence is probably the thing that matters most. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Can totally subscribe to that because it's present. Without the presence, you cannot hold the space.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And there's a kind of respect, I think, that comes in a when you're creating a space where we're asking people to step in with some vulnerability. We're trying to do it in a way that has this sort of container of the collective energy. And obviously that energy can be, you know, you can imagine sometimes just the energy. And even on the screen, sometimes just the energy in a space. I can come off of a call and need to go and immediately lie down because it's just, you've really felt it. So having everybody's presence there helps that to be as kind of healthy and supportive energy as it possibly can, actually.
Yeah. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, guiding me through into this world, complex world of yeah, looking at DEI through a different lens.
Yeah, I really enjoy it, actually. I enjoy the challenge. I enjoy the unpicking. I enjoy the different ways of thinking about how we can make steps forward, how we can, you know, the coaching part of me is about unlocking potential, right? So what's the potential of this organization to make a bigger impact? What's the potential of this leader to transform the way that they lead and the lives of others? Like, what can we unlock in the culture that really could take that strength that they have and mean that they approach this topic and these issues in a really different way? So I do approach it from a strengths-based approach. But obviously that means that you need to sit with lots of other things to kind of identify and work with that. But it's because of that, it does feel really enjoyable.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. And if someone wants to reach out to work for you, learn more about the topic and how to approach or create a space of for anti-racism in their organization, put all the links in the show notes.
Amazing. Thank you so much.